On Monday, the 12th of August 2024, the City of Victor Harbor commenced its elector representation review. Tracey Riddle from Kelledy Jones discusses the representation review process. The review, mandated under the Local Government Act, examines electoral representations, including the possibility of implementing wards. Tracey explains the statutory requirements, the pros and cons of wards versus no wards, and the potential impact on council operations. Councillors engage in a detailed discussion about these options, raising questions on representation costs and community feedback. This is the first of several workshops aimed at drafting a comprehensive report for submission to the Electoral Commissioner. Now let's join the meeting.
What is it that we have to pull together by way of a report? And what's the process in terms of submitting that to the Electoral Commissioner and his staff, and what are they looking for as part of that? And it is, look, the really important thing in terms of this type of process is it's very much driven by the provisions under the Local Government Act. And actually, I've got those provisions, Kyla. Are you happy for me just to hand them out? I know some people sort of like to have a copy of that in front of them as well, so that we can sort of step through it. But there are some, the main sections of the Act that deal with your representation review are sections 11 and 12. And section 26 and 33. And what I'll go through in this session, and I've got those for you here, is what it is that we need to make sure we cover off in the report. Because it is, as I mentioned, very driven by what the Electoral Commissioner and his staff are looking for in terms of turning our mind to certain things and making sure that we put those in the report. And it is something that you need to consult on. Helpfully, as part of the most recent sort of broader reforms that have occurred to the Local Government Act, it is not as convoluted a process as what it used to be. So the old process used to be, we had to sit around and talk about what different options you might want to have by way of, how many elected members, whether we had wards or no wards, whether you wanted to change the name of the council, as well as whether the mayor was going to be elected by the community as a whole, or elected. There used to be a model, and again, this one is now gone with the recent amendments, but there are still some regional councils that just have area councillors that are elected by the community as a whole, and then the elected members choose amongst them who is going to be, and it's the chairperson for the purposes of the Act. Usually they still go by the name of mayor. That can no longer happen anymore, so as part of the reforms that have been made. So there are also a number of councils that are going through this process because they have to change that model as well, because by the time they get to the next elections process in November 2026, they actually have to have the model in place where the mayor is chosen by the community as a whole. But yours is effectively a time-based one as part of your relevant review process. Is this one I'm using? Sometimes I need to be woken up.
No, let me know and I can...
Oh, okay, yeah. So we're ready for the next one. Probably need to, you can go 2 in, Kyla. I think the next one's just a cover page.
Next one?
Yep, thank you. So largely, I've already spoken about that. Your last process was concluded in July 2017. So effectively that meant the last time that you as a chamber looked at, and it's called a representation review because what we're looking at is your representation of your residents and ratepayers across the council area. So the last time you as a chamber looked at whether you did or did not want to have wards in place and how many elected members you wanted to have. And whether, again, as I mentioned, you would have a mayor elected by the community as a whole or from within was back sort of 2017. So that's obviously a map from your website of the council's area. I will go into some more detail in a moment because it seems to me, and again, so from briefings we've had with staff as well, that one of the biggest things for you as part of this process will be to turn your minds to whether or not you want to put wards in place, or whether you want to retain your existing composition, which is a no ward composition. And there are some benefits benefits to both of those options that we will go through. Of course, we're not making decisions at this session. This is an information and briefing session. This is just an outline of the process, but we have locked in, I think there's another 3 workshops locked in over the course of this process. You've also received those questionnaires as well, so we've pulled together that information. So following tonight's session and the discussion that we have tonight, the next step for us will be to pull together a draft report for you to have a look at, and then we can have a discussion about that draft report at your next workshop. Because what we don't want, we certainly see some councils try and fast track these through. We don't, want a sort of lengthy, detailed report, lobbing into, an agenda report for a council meeting where you've not had the chance to have a look at it and to make sure it covers what you want it to cover. So what do we talk about when we talk about your electoral representation review? And this is a really important point as well, because what we're actually looking at as part of the review process is the number of electors in the council area. That's not the number of your residents and ratepayers. That is the number of people so based on the House of Assembly roll that we get, they are the people that are entitled to vote for elected members here in the council area, as well as the council has maintained what's called a council's voters roll. So if you're not on the House of Assembly roll, so if it's not, for example, your principal place of residence in the council area, but you might have a holiday home, so obviously a council of your composition is going to have, a whole host of people that don't necessarily live in the area but have a holiday house, they actually need to make application with the council to get put onto the council voters roll. And if they don't, then they're not entitled to vote for anyone that might nominate as part of your next elections process. So the way that we then calculate who we are talking about then in terms of the electors is the number of people that are on that House of Assembly roll plus those people that are on the council voters roll. And then it's those figures that the Electoral Commissioner staff use to work out what's called the quota. So the last figures, they are some of the recent figures from the Electoral Commission. These were provided in February of this year. They obviously do tend to go sort of up a bit over, that period of time. So when we build the report for you, we'll make sure you've got the most updated figures. But effectively what that demonstrates is obviously that the council area does not have wards. As of February of this year, you had a total of 13,601 electors. And that quota number, that's the figure that the Electoral Commissioner and his staff use to say, so effectively, you are then each individually, and we include the mayor in this figure, you are each representing 1,511 people each. Now, we know it is far greater than that because you are representing all of your residents and ratepayers in the council area. And so that's something we obviously pick up in the report. But in terms of, I go back to, I mentioned before, this is a very process-driven review that is overseen by the Electoral Commissioner. When he looks at what the representation figures are per elected member and per your electors, that's the figure he uses. So if, for example, and it's not, obviously not an issue for your council, but one of the other amendments that has come into the Local Government Elections Act, and one of those that I've included in that handout I've given to you, is there is now a provision under Section 11A which effectively puts a cap on elected members. So councils must not be constituted, and again, by the time we get to the next elections process, councils must not be constituted of more than 13 members, and that includes the mayor. So there are still a number of councils around that have more than 12 members and a mayor. So City of West Torrens, City of Charles Sturt, Port Adelaide Enfield. So when you look at things like those quota numbers, that's what the Electoral Commissioner and his staff look at in terms of, so as part of this review process, you all of a sudden went, well, actually we want to add a whole host of new members. We want to get up to sort of 12 members. The Electoral Commission will start looking at, we need to put in some justification around any kind of increase that you might be wanting to put in terms of member representation. And we can do that, and obviously we're guided by you in terms of that process. But the way that we have to justify that is things like increases in development. So when we do these reports, we get information from your planning departments around what the new building rates have been in the council area since your last electoral review process, what land you might be having coming online, looking at where there might be then a potential influx of electors in the council area. So again, the information that we put into that report is very much guided by what it is that you want to do by way of your composition. And so that's the number, that electoral quota number, is the number that is first of all used by the Electoral Commissioner in terms of saying, and it's really interesting because, statistics, you can kind of hide a whole lot of things in statistics. If you look at that quota number, for example, in a council the size of, Walkerville, so a small council, still with, number of elected members, that quota, is really low. And so that is at times being used as a justification for that council should have less elected members than what they've got, because when the comparison is done across the state with other councils, it looks like it's almost an over-representation situation. Yeah.
Thanks. So just a couple of questions. So 13 is the maximum elected members. Is that going to change when councils amalgamate? Because I do believe the LGA, is there a report LGA have done about amalgamating Yank, Victor and Gould Council?
So I'm not aware of a report that has been done. I do know that it's still a live conversation that's being had. I mean, obviously we saw as part of the last elections process where it was literally announced the day prior that, as part of that elections process, that the electors in Grant and Mount Gambier were being asked about amalgamation. That, I think, sort of horribly backfired perhaps on the government, because both of those council areas overwhelmingly said no to that. Yeah. But it doesn't mean that it's gone away as an issue. At the moment, so this is one of the amendments that has been made that applies now. The difficulty is, and depending on what size council area you end up in, and that's why I say you can hide a whole lot of things in statistics, because quite often if we get councils that say they want to increase their member numbers, for their electoral representation, quite often what the Electoral Commissioner comes back with is Onkaparinga. So one of the largest council areas, obviously, with the most electors across the state, when they did their last representation review, knowing that this provision was coming in, actually reduced its numbers. I think that they were running with about 20 elected members, I think, at one stage. Reduced it down to 12 members plus the mayor.
But they have wards.
And they've got wards, yeah. But when those quota numbers don't change with wards, in terms of, because that quota number, we come back to what I said, what I was saying earlier, that is the figure that the Commissioner has in his head that, you are all nominally responsible for 1,511 electors. And it's a really blunt instrument in terms of measuring that, but that's what he does. So if you look at the quota numbers for Onkaparinga, it actually sits around the same as well.
Just a quick question. Historically, didn't Victor previously have wards with a smaller population base?
I think it did have in the past. Had wards? Did you have wards? Long time ago?
Yeah, in the 80s and early 90s.
No, it's possible, but I don't think so, because I think there was the district council of Encounter Bay, and so it was more separate.
Yeah,
I think it's back when they had 2-year terms of councils. I was talking with Peter Lewis's wife, and she said they did.
And so perhaps if we move on to the next slides, because while we're having the ward conversation. I mentioned before it's been streamlined. We only now need to do the one report, which is good. So we don't have to come up with, what councils used to have to do is, for example, come up with 4 or 5 options, wards, no wards, how many elected members. Then we had to go out to public consultation on that. It was a minimum of 6 weeks. It had to be in the Gazette, it had to be in the paper. Then it came back, then you as a chamber then had to choose one of those based on the feedback from consultation. Then we had to do a second report. Then we had to consult on that, and that was another 6 weeks, and that's all gone now. We just now need to do one report, and that's why we're saying that we're going to make sure, as part of these workshops, that report, once it gets into the chamber, reflects, what it is that you're looking for by way of representation.
Sorry, but we will go out to consultation regarding wards.
Yeah, and I'll go through the steps. So we still need to do a consultation, but we only need to do one now instead of those 2 reports. So we just do the one report.
So, and will that consultation be before the report's finished? So the report is on the consultation and what discussions the chamber have said, or this will be a report before the consultation?
So based on the conversations and the feedback that we receive from members, we'll draft a report that will go to you to a council meeting for you to adopt for the purposes of consultation. So a bit like your budgetary process. And that's why I say we want to make sure that we take the time during these workshops to make sure that reflects what it is you'd like to consult on, rather than sort of having that discussion during your council meeting where you might not have as much time to do so.
And I'm assuming that we would get the information from the 2017 consultation where they did discuss wards, for
Yes.
example?
So we can certainly pull all that out and circulate that as well. Yeah. So the Act talks about needing to comprehensively examine all aspects, and I think, and I've listed there those dot points when you have a look at these provisions here under 11 and particularly 12. They set out what council needs to turn its mind to as part of this process. Now, we know that the wards conversation will be the one of most importance for you, but we actually also have to. So, for example, one of the things on this list says, whether or not you want to change the name of the council. Now, most chambers don't tend to want to. If you ever did want to change the name of the council, this is the process that you use to do so. But even if you don't want to change the name of the council, we still have to make sure in the report we have a paragraph that says, you turned your mind to it and you don't want to. So that's how sort of detailed it is that the Electoral Commissioner and his staff go in terms of, assessing the report that's prepared against, it's almost like a checklist is the way that the Act is used.
Sorry, just a quick question. Before the next council election, is it likely, I understand the local government minister is doing a review about engagement in council elections. Is there a consideration that he may change the term of office for councils? It was 2 years, it is 4 years.
Yeah.
People are saying 3 years is being bandied around.
So it's interesting again, because that's another one of those. So this process for you, so those councils that have to go to a model where the mayor is elected by the community as a whole, and those councils that need to bring their numbers back within the tolerances under 11A, unless they get an exemption, there is an exemption process. They just have to make sure those processes have been done as part of a review like this before we get to the next elections in November 2026. Yours is different because you're doing your representation review because this is your relevant period, and so there's a Gazette notice that says that you need to do it between sort of this period of time and this period of time. So yours will be done effectively in terms of the timelines, and I think the timelines might have come through to you. Initially, yeah. So that timeline, if you get, what's the last month on that? That takes us through to
March. Because it's finalised.
Yeah.
It's been submitted. So
Yes.
that's the report 28th of January.
Yeah, so we just need to, so we will make sure your process is done by then because that's what the Gazette notice requires us to do. So then in terms of then coming back to your query about, what might be happening between now and then, it might be relevant, but we just really need to just give effect to what's in the Act at the moment. It is interesting, but we've also heard the same thing because we do know the Electoral Commissioner in particular would like to get local government elections away from the state election cycle. And the only way to do that will potentially be to perhaps shorten or add a year to this particular term of council. And so that's been bandied about. But it is relevant in terms of, even though we need to get the review done by that period of time, it does not come into effect until that next elections process. So, if, for example, we say, you want to go down the road and the council wants to put wards in place, that won't happen in April next year. The decision will be made, but it comes in place in terms of the next election cycle. And that's so, again, so that there is no change really then in terms of you giving your representation in the manner that you do now as part of this term. And so that is important for that sense. So wards and no wards. And so what I've done, and you've got these as well to take away and to have a look at, because again, when we build these reports, we also have to go through the pros and cons of each of these things as well. So when we talk about the benefits of having elected members from a ward, so they at times have been described to be, it's almost a bit like I guess if you think about state parliament, it's like, you have sort of a policy area. If you're electing elected members from a ward, there is almost, the expectation that elected member will have an in-depth understanding of the issues of what's happening in that ward and will be effectively almost the champion of that ward in some respects. The interesting thing is you don't necessarily have to live in the ward if you're going to nominate to be elected as the elected member within the ward, which undermines that a little bit in that sense. But that's why I sort of prefer to describe it as a bit of a policy area as well. And so you'll probably remember for the first time again this year as part of these election cycles, you had to actually in your nomination form, you wouldn't have to without wards, but those councils with wards had to, for the first time, say on their nominations form whether they lived in the ward or not. So you can still nominate for a ward you don't live in, but it had to be declared.
So is that nomination of being, if you're not in the ward, like you said, that kind of circumvents the whole point of being that representative?
In some sense.
And some people seem to think that if I go to this ward, I've got more chance of getting elected.
Yes.
So is that a local government, like is that legislation, or is that just, that can be amended so that you have to be from that area? Because otherwise, what's the point of wards?
So at the moment, so it's not been, it hasn't been amended, and there are 3 reviews going on at the moment in terms of the elections process. So there's one that the Electoral Commissioner is doing himself, after probably it was a bit of a debacle last time around in terms of all the issues that happened with different things, around campaign donation returns, around we didn't have any visibility around nominations for the first time. So more broadly, there is a review of that. There's also an LGA review, and there's one that was called by the former, and this is where the LGA is involved as well. So the former Minister Brock, the one that you were alluding to as well, where it was almost sort of like everything was thrown into the bucket of community engagement, and because we still don't have a community engagement charter that was supposed to come through under the Local Government Act as well. But part of that review as well is around things like mandatory voting in local government elections and things like that. So that's sort of a representation review type review process as well. So as part of that, they might pick up on things like, if you are nominating for a ward, you need to live in the ward, but at the moment you don't have to. Same thing, in terms of being an elected member, you don't necessarily don't have to live in the council area, but you just have to be an elector in the council area. So you have to own property or, have a business in the council area as well.
Is that for a minimum of 3 months?
In terms of the council role, what's the council role timeframes? I don't know if there's any minimums at all. I think it's just a point in time.
I know there was a lot of discussion which happened obviously with the election in Adelaide about a lot of international students.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And
they're
for 3 months and they're entitled to vote in local government.
Yes, and that's a bit different again because they were not residents of the country either. Yeah. No. Yeah. So and so that obviously is the issue of former Councillor Hyde's challenge, which is still going through court. And interestingly, when they did the count back of those processes, then they found that there was anomalies in the Adelaide Plains Council. And so there's still 3 elected members that don't really know what's going on with their roles there at the moment either, which is a bit bizarre. But your point, the point you make is also something that the Electoral Commissioner has said, and that is very much, he is very strongly of the view that it doesn't serve the democratic process for people in the last few days and leading up to voting to be kind of belting into the front office and changing what wards they might be nominating in, because there might be 10 there and 5 there. So that for him was one of the biggest reasons around sort of removing that visibility around nominations. Now I think it had some unintended consequences, particularly for regional councils, which is obviously being looked at more broadly.
I believe the ward hopping was a major factor where they tried to keep confidence who was in the ward for the election.
Yeah.
But they found that people were still doing it and it was still an issue. So I agree. I think it's quite complicated and they need to either make it simpler by living in the ward or because people were jumping around looking at where the best chance of being elected was.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. No, that's right. And look, the other thing though is that first dot point. So, the expectation then that if you are the ward councillor, whether you do or don't live in there, is that you will probably go to events or you will probably support different community groups or communities of interest potentially within that ward. So you will be almost a ward expert if you were the ward councillor. Now, the other interesting thing is, and some elected members don't understand this either, and certainly members of the public don't, is that just because, if you do put wards in, just because you are a ward councillor, doesn't mean that any other resident or ratepayer could go to any one of you to ask for assistance, because you are still an elected member across the council area as a whole, and so not just for that particular ward. And that which leads into that second dot point as well. We've spoken about that. that the electors would consider that if you did have wards in place, that the ward members would be aware of sort of those local issues of interest, and so would be, the champion, as it was, of sporting clubs in that ward or schools in that ward, for example, in terms of the work that you do. Depending on the size of the council area as well, sometimes one of the advantages of wards has been said to be that it's more accessible. So, if a resident or a ratepayer was looking, to go to see their ward councillor, again, this goes back to if the ward councillor doesn't necessarily live in that area, they still might be having to travel. But one of the advantages has been said, the anticipation is that they might be more accessible for members of the community to talk to their ward councillors, and which is that large geographical area as well. Area councillors are what you are, and so by area councillor we mean, obviously at the moment you don't have wards, so you are all area councillors. So, it has been said that, the role of an area councillor could be quite time consuming, if you're going from one end of the council area to the other, in terms of residents and ratepayers that, might want to speak with you or catch up with you. So that's, again, being said to be one of the positives of putting a ward in place. It can be said that if wards are in place, there's less opportunity for special interest groups to gain control of council. Now, by that we mean, if you've got wards and you have sort of 5 people nominated for a ward, you need to choose who it is that you want to represent you in that ward. Whereas if we've got 10 people that have nominated across the whole council area, the electors are choosing those council members across the whole area, and you can have sort of special interest groups. Then we know that a lot of these, and you probably equally might have experienced yourselves, some of the decisions made in terms of who is elected can come down to a handful of votes. So certainly it has been said if there are wards in place, then that can sort of prevent that from happening. Equally, and in a moment we'll get to the other slide, it also does mean, and especially if we don't have any visibility around who's nominating now in wards, is if you were all nominated for the same ward, and that ward was only having 2 ward councillors, we might all of a sudden lose the experience of 4 really experienced elected members. So that's one of the disadvantages of the ward model as well. So in terms of the benefits that have been described of the model that you've got now, leading on from what we were just saying then as well, was it gives greater choice to your residents or ratepayers about who they want to elect in as their area councillor, because they're not locked down to smaller ward lists. And similar to that, voters can choose their sort of best or their preferred candidates rather than just being restricted to candidates within their ward. And smaller communities can still have a local candidate elected if they assist and help and run that strong campaign. And go over again. Okay, but maybe just go back. We'll have a bit of a discussion about that. So look, certainly there are benefits to both options. And, it seems to me that this is probably going to be the biggest decision for you as part of this process, and including then whether or not you want to increase elected members. What I can say, so we've already had very early engagement and a number of conversations with the Electoral Commissioner and his staff. They'll be looking quite closely at that quota number that I talked about earlier on. We'd have to be coming up with some, I think, really strong arguments if you wanted to look at increasing elected members. But certainly I think the wards question is going to be the one for you in terms of what it is that you want to do moving forward with your wards.
What would be helpful for us is to know potentially what the ward areas are, to get a better understanding. Like you can slice and dice.
Exactly. Well, and that's a really important point. So if we bring that map back up, Kyla, because that quota, that number becomes really important again. So if, for example, in a minute I'll come to, I've just got a bit of a pictorial about the outcome of the consultation or the questionnaires that you did. It's not a matter of us just sitting here and going, just say sort of like, that looks nice and neat and tidy if, we divide it up into 4 wards, for example, or if we go with 3 wards. What we then need to look at is if we draw that up, we then need to calculate how many electors are in each of those wards. And these provisions, section 33, say any one ward cannot have plus or minus 10% more electors than the other ward. And again, that comes back down, first of all, to representation. So it's about, you know, so for example, when you look at that township centre, you couldn't just make that one ward, because all of a sudden you've got all the electors in the council area all in that one place. So whoever might be the ward councillors there, you know, first of all, underrepresented for those electors in terms of that quota number. But also, that's where all the people were voting. So, you know, so again, it's got to be, once we draw that up, we then have to find that plus or minus 10% tolerance as well.
Well, one of the challenges is certainly the rural areas of Victor Harbour, because obviously the CBD area is going to have more people, or places that have developed like McCracken and so forth. So it's giving them the representation, but within trying to get the same and equivalent numbers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it's, look, and some of it is crystal ball gazing, because if you do decide that you want to go with wards, we then need to draw that up and need to show what it looks like. We then need to say how many ward councillors you want in each ward. We then have to work out the tolerances. We then have to sort of potentially move some boundary lines. What the Electoral Commissioner will look at is that the wards should make sense. And by that, they prefer boundaries down sort of main roads rather than, you know, through the middle of parks and things like that. Certainly not sort of through houses. And using as best as we can, sometimes land features, you know, can be a good thing in terms of, you know, a river or a hills that might be around the place as well, because again, it's about communities of interest and accessibility in terms of drawing up some of those wards as well. And
I think last time, and correct me, I think they're talking about potentially 4. So let's just say there was 4, and you've got 2 elected members per ward, for example. Well, we've got 9, so how does that work?
So you don't count the mayor.
Okay.
Yeah. So and so that again, in terms of then your numbers and how we draw that up, we leave the mayor. Interestingly, the mayor gets counted for the purposes of working out the quota, but the mayor doesn't get counted when we look at the wards and ward tolerances. Yeah. And so that needs to be taken into account in terms of numbers of wards and then how many elected members. The other thing on that in terms of, you know, elected member numbers is again, you know, it is still one of the things to turn your mind to. Some councils have said an even number of members can be difficult, you know, if there's, you know, going to be then an even number of votes in the chambers. But most councils tend to, you know, manage that quite well. The mayors obviously then always have a casting vote. But some councils prefer odd numbers of elected members for that reason as well. So in terms of process, so basically this is what we're doing first. Just sort of high-level overview about what it is and why we have to do it. And with the next slide, Kyla, so the next step from this, and we'll have some more broad discussion in a moment, the next step is then, obviously, we go away from this and we draft a report for you to have a look at. I think probably the first step will be, subject to what you want to do about wards, it might also be sort of drawing up maps and seeing what they look like as well. It is only once we've got that, and we'll have another workshop, it's once we've got that in a form that, you know, looks like what it is that you want it to look like, it then goes to you in the chamber. We still need to consult on it, but we only need to consult on that one option. We don't have to go out with a huge number of options, and I think that that's where the process got confusing at times for residents and ratepayers. So effectively, you are saying this is the option that we want to go out and consult with. Now, we still need to take into account the feedback from, and the feedback's not just restricted to electors. It can come from any interested person, is what the Act talks about. So we do start to see some special interest groups that, you know, like to, you know, put in a submission more generally around, you know, more democratic processes and things like that. So we get some of those general ones, but we do tend to get more direct feedback from your residents and ratepayers.
With the residents' feedback, with other locations or historically, what is roughly the number that they say, well, hang on, the majority of people are actually wanting this option as opposed to this? I would have thought it was over 50%.
So, well, it's really hard, and it's a bit like your budget process. And, you know, unfortunately, we tend to find you get more feedback on your budget after it's been adopted and your first rates notice goes out, which is, of course, then is too late. So councils have always had a challenge with engaging, in terms of any consultation process, and this is no different. And I think the amendments that have been made are good in terms of it was such a convoluted and long process that people were just confused about what was happening. So now that it's been streamlined, I think it will make it easier for people to engage with it. In terms of the feedback though, just like everything, it is the decision ultimately will be for you as the chamber. Feedback will be relevant, but it can't take the place of what decision it is that you think might be in the best interest of the community moving forward as well. Look, and so sometimes, for example, I see, consultation reports, not just even necessarily on representation reviews, but it might be, 80% of the people that responded to the consultation process were, against the proposal. And then when you go, well, actually, what are the numbers behind that? And it might be 100 people put a submission in. And so is 100 people in terms of being against a proposal? What is the weight that we give that when we, look at a council area of, in a sense, 13,000 electors, and that's not even the number of residents and ratepayers. So it does have weight. We do need to take it into account, but it is just one of the factors that gets taken into account as well. Yeah.
So once we actually decide on a ward area, does that area stay the same, or does it move as the population increases?
So it will stay the same and get reviewed at each representation review process. So each relevant period, so that's every 7 or 8 years, again, you need to review, are you going to keep the awards? Because you could then choose to abolish them. You might go, this is actually not really working anymore. Or it didn't work. So at that point is when you review it again, but there is a provision in the Act, and I was talking about those tolerances, those plus or 10%. There comes a time where if the tolerance is so far kicked down, I think it's set at 20%. Once you hit that 20%, if it's plus or minus, the Electoral Commissioner will say you've got to revisit your ward boundaries again because they've been thrown right out. So so that can happen, but rarely does that happen. But that's the other thing that the Electoral Commissioner's staff will be looking at in terms of the report that we put in. So if you do choose to go with wards, we set that out, we've got to put the maps in, we have to put the figures in, we've got to actually then show what the quotas are. If, for example, we put that in and it was like 9.98%, I know the Electoral Commissioner's staff will send it back and go, that is going to be too tight. Like, can you look at moving that boundary so that there is a bit more flexibility, bearing in mind that this needs to, stay in place for the council for its next 7 or 8 years.
And to establish the wards, what is the cost? Is that a cost to council? Do the government pay it? And what would it be approximate? Because it would be needed to be put into our budget.
So it's done as part of this process. So in terms of, the administrative costs in terms of going, okay, we're now a council that's going to have wards and this is what it looks like, is done as part of this process. There are going to be additional costs for council though, and so administration would be able to tell you, the cost would be, for example, amendments that would be need to make to websites, for example, or to correspondence, or updating perhaps, suites of documents to reflect the fact that the council now has wards and ward councillors. So there would obviously be administrative costs there. But the costs are also greater at the elections time, because then the Electoral Commissioner has to run individual ward elections, not just the one council election across the area. But they are certainly, we can probably get some figures for the next meeting, Kyla, around some of that, yeah. And I can certainly find out from the X's staff around what the additional costs at the elections process time will be, because it's all of a sudden then the Electoral Commissioner and his staff have to run ward elections rather than a whole of council election, and that's one of the pros and cons that's on that list as well.
When you say there's extra cost because you divide up into wards, wouldn't the staff allocation be the same? Because if you have 11,000 people voting once, so many voting booths, or you have 3 separate votes of, you're still the same amount of people per voter that you would need to hold that election, wouldn't it be? So
at the moment, what happens with your elections now is your electors in the council area will get their ballot paper with all of your names on it, and then there'll be obviously a separate one for the mayoral election process. Once that there are wards though, your individual electors in the wards will get a ward ballot paper with just those people that have nominated for that ward. So all of a sudden then, instead of running So the area councillor and the mayoral elections process, the electoral commissioner is running, let's say if you do 4 wards, they're doing 4 separate elections effectively for the council, plus the mayoral election, which does come with additional cost. Because each ward is effectively a separate elections process.
But it's on the same day?
Yeah, it's all part of the same, all part of that same day, same process, and they all get announced at the same time.
But the voters are still only voting on 2 selections, a mayor and a councillor, whether it's an area councillor or a ward councillor, or 2. So they're not doing more voting. It becomes more complicated for the electoral staff and volunteers, like a federal election or where you've got multiple candidates.
So the difference is it's instead of 2 elections processes, you'll have 5 if you had 4 wards, for example. So 4 wards plus the mayor. That's 5 separate elections processes, like counting processes, quota processes that the Electoral Commissioner and his staff do, and they charge more for them. Yeah. It also, look, the other thing is in terms of when we talk about the benefits, positives and negatives of wards, is that, and what we experienced with the last elections process where there's no visibility around nominations, is with wards we saw a greater propensity, I guess, for there to be failed elections processes because we didn't have enough people nominating in the wards. Whereas if, council like yours where you don't have wards, we tended to find there wasn't as much of an issue around that because, if you had 4 wards, for example, and you had 5 people nominating one and only 1 nominating the other, then all of a sudden the council's then having to run a supplementary election process because they're missing a ward councillor over in that ward. And again, that's additional cost for the council as well in the supplementary election process. The way that they try, well, one of the ways that was balanced out was the new provision that came in, the count back provision as well. So, for example, you did have wards and 2 people were elected, but 1 person either resigned or was unable to take on the role. Then, as long as it was within the first 12 months through a count back, the person who kind of effectively came next could have been offered the role. But obviously that is not something, we can't rely on the count back if we didn't get enough people nominating in the first place. So, and I think, I think that there is it'd be really interesting to see where the Electoral Commissioner lands around that visibility around nominations, because I think it's really important that we do know how many people nominate and in what ward. But no, so that's not going to happen though between now and when we finish this process, unfortunately. So we get the submissions, you take into account the submissions, we then finalise the report, so you might want to make some amendments to the report based on your submissions. Obviously there's an obligation that we take those into account. We have to then include those submissions into the report. You then adopt that report as your final report, and then that's what we then send to the Electoral Commissioner and his staff. And then that's when they sit there and they make sure, I talked about it being sort of legislatively driven, that's where they sit there and they make sure that we've covered off on everything in that report that we needed to cover off on. And if it's not been, then that's when it gets sort of sent back to the council for the council to have a look at. Touch wood, with any of these processes that we've ever been involved in, nothing's been sent back to the council, but certainly, we know some councils have had things sent back. So that tolerance one was one example. I know council, they were so close to their 10%, the Electoral Commissioner thought, because we really are talking about it, when we were doing Charles Sturt's, I reckon it was the semaphore ward was so close that, we were sort of moving it sort of road by road, and because those electoral numbers can go up and down, and the Electoral Commission, and every 3 months they're updated, and so literally like 10 or 11 electors would throw that out again, and so, they really don't like it being too tight, so we've got to be careful with that as well.
So besides having the maps and approximates as to how the voters are divided up, it would probably also be useful to have where there are known growth areas.
Yeah.
Because where we may think, okay, something like the Kraken, they're expecting X amount of growth, which will occur within the first couple of years, so we can take that into account.
Yeah, and that's where some of that crystal ball gazing needs to come into it as well, because what we want to make sure is that we don't hit that 20% tolerance where then the Electoral Commissioner will say, well look, we know it's not time to do another review yet, but your tolerances are so far out, your quotas are so far out with your wards that you need to do it again. And look at that, I must admit, that's one of the benefits of having the model you have now. You never have to worry about those ward tolerances because, you are area councillors across the whole council area as well. So that's also, one of the things to take into account. I think I'll go to the next one. And then, it's gazetted at the end. And as I mentioned, the changes don't come into effect though until the next process, until the next cycle. Next election cycle. And so if you were to make those changes, if you were to go down that road of putting wards in, obviously that also gives the administration time to put that in place as well between now and then, so we've got time for that. So your current composition and structure obviously is, so you're tracking with 9. So that's the other thing when we start looking at wards as well is, and if we go over to the next one, Kyla. So for example, in terms of the outcomes, so if you went, we want to go with 4 wards, that means, and then you've got those tolerances, that means that we're going to have then 3 wards that would have 2 elected members and 1 ward's going to have 3. And so that might work. So, that might be the ward that has 3 might be the one that probably might be centred more around the township. But that quota number, so when you've got a ward with 3, then all of a sudden we divide the electors by 3, not by 2, which we would do in the other wards. So again, just considerations in terms of what the division might look like. So obviously changing the council name. So one person, so the 8 responses we got, one person had thought that might be worth thinking about. In terms of having wards or no wards, so of those 8 responses we got, 3 wanted to have wards in place and 5 wanted to continue with no wards. Yeah.
It's pretty much how most of the votes go to be 3 to 4.
Yeah. And I know there's what are we missing? There was a couple missing still. In terms of everyone largely, happy to stay with your current composition, I think that's wise. I just think if, we're trying to increase numbers of members, and certainly increasing numbers of members would be a hard road to get across with the Electoral Commissioner in terms of the current climate. It's the number of wards that obviously, as I mentioned before, will be the discussion point for your council and what that looks like. So, if we were to go with 3 wards, so 3 wards with 3 councillors divides up quite well. Like if that's, because you've got 9 elected members in the mayor, don't you? Yeah. So that, sort of divides up quite evenly in terms of that process. Some of the other benefits that people tend to say is that at least if you do have 3 councillors in a ward, then if someone is not well or if they're on an extended period of leave, there's still 2 other elected members, 2 other 2 ward councillors around. Whereas if you've got a model that's got 2 ward councillors and then one's missing, sort of a lot of the work can fall onto another member from time to time.
But you can have 8 councillors, say 4 wards, 8 councillors.
You could do that. You could reduce your number. That would be then would see a reduction in the number of elected members you have in the chamber.
With proper representation, it's less chance of factions then, isn't it?
But I don't know that necessarily going down to 8.
Have these factions.
Well, I don't think going down to 8 members necessarily addresses that. What it would do is, so that quota, when we talk about that figure of nominally the number of electors that each of you are sort of responsible for, what do you say that figure was? 1,511? If you lost an elected member, then obviously those 1,500 then get divided up amongst the remaining elected members, so that goes up in terms of effectively the work that you would be responsible for as elected members. But that's something that you might want to entertain, going down to have 8 elected members plus the mayor. But I think, if you generally feel like it's working well in terms of your work levels now, probably wouldn't be looking at reducing your numbers. I'm not sure if that's something you've spoken about before. But certainly this is the opportunity to do it as part of this process.
I'm assuming you're taking the whole role of doing this complete review.
Doing what, sorry?
The review.
We did the whole,
So
from
you
start to finish.
You're doing.
Michael and I, yeah.
Yes, because last time we had a consultant, Mr. Rowe,
Yes.
in 2000. So one of the questions that come from the community is how independent, whether you're for or against wards as a consultant to run the process. Because that's what came out last time.
From the consultant.
Yeah, is the consultant for or against wards? Because that's what the community were wanting to know.
So I don't care. Like, honestly, so look, I could say it's a much easier report to write if I don't have to do wards. But that's, look, honestly. So it's interesting. I have spoken about doing these representation review processes for years and years. Michael is actually against wards. So, but I don't think that doesn't impact how we write the report. But he would say, and I think where he gets that from is, and it's not, I think it's certainly something that has travelled through and been ironed out a bit more in the sector. But it's when we had those early amalgamations, when all of a sudden there was an us and them. And so, for example, if we use Loxton Wakery, so sometimes it can be said, there's those elected members that, are elected members at Loxton and those that are Wakery, and then that can sort of create a bit of a division in the chamber in terms of that kind of process. So having been involved in a lot of those early amalgamations, I think has felt that no wards has tended to work better because it reduces those issues of factionalisation that can occur if wards are created. But no, at the end of the day, this is not our report, and that is why we've got 3-4 workshops to make sure that what is in the report is what you want moving forward. And all we need to do is make sure that each of those provisions under the Act are addressed, and it gets then certified by the Electoral Commission staff. But it's, we don't live here in the area, so there's no sort of impact there in terms of what it might be said personally that we would want to see happen at all. So, no, have you just put in the report what it is that you're after as part of this process?
Just regarding that report we were talking about before about amalgamations, and if we didn't have wards, when you look at voter engagement, I think Victor Harbour has one of the highest voter engagements. So if you ended up amalgamating, Yank, Victor and Alexandrina, you may end up with a lot of electors coming out of the area that has the most voter engagement, which would not be a proper representation of those other areas. So is there any chance we can see that report, the amalgamation report?
So I don't know what report you're talking about. That's what I said earlier. I know you said that there's one being written, but I'm not aware of it.
No?
No.
There's no report
Not that I'm aware of.
of amalgamations? No, okay.
Not that I'm aware of. I'm not saying there's not one, but it's nothing. Not that I'm aware of, or not that I've been involved in.
Futures, I think it's the Futures paper, wasn't it? Went out in 2000. It was 2014, 2018.
We could have
Futures.
be interested to know what that report actually contains.
The only one I can think of was there was a Flurio Futures report that was done a while ago, which was I think the Southern Hills were part of that as well, but it was essentially just looking at options. I think I'm not sure whether the report was public or where it was at the end, but I can ask the question and find out to at least let you know whether it is available or not. But it was a number of years ago. I remember going to some with I think it was back when Graham Maxwell was here. Actually, I remember going to a meeting with him at that stage. Just preliminary, but I haven't seen the final report either, but I can certainly find out for you.
Okay, thanks.
And I'm certainly not aware of any other body of work that is being done in that space currently. But I'd be surprised if it wasn't on the agenda for the state government, having sort of so recently tried it at Grant and Mount Gambier.
We were saying before about wards and area councillors. I'd agree with that just because you are representing a ward doesn't mean you're not representing the whole city.
Yeah.
And I think that can be a misconception by the community. I actually also think that potentially being a ward councillor is more work because you're potentially people will expect you to be representing them and contact you a lot more. At the moment, they probably contact the council more than they do area councillors. I also think that wards will give, I think, good representation of areas without compromising the broader area. I think also that it helps to break up voting factions. I think that where they say that although you have factions in wards, I would argue that you can have area councillors with singular issues or multiple issues that do the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's about whether those people are representing the whole community or special interest groups.
Look, and so some councils have found that wards have been really effective. So if, for example, you've got, a sort of well-defined agricultural area and a well-defined coastal area and a well-defined tourism area, so, very similar, I guess, to your council, drawing wards up along sort of those type of lines, again, keeping in mind our tolerances, has for some councils worked well because then it's meant, those ward councillors then, going back to sort of that specialisation or that policy area, focus on, those individual things of interest for those communities in each of those ward areas.
Well, one of the benefits I see of wards is certainly in rural areas, it actually exposes each of the elected members to not just the more metropolitan areas, but also the needs and issues of rural, rural roads, other issues that they may not necessarily see day to day. And I think that's actually good.
Yeah, that's right.
I actually believe we look at our council, we've got 3 councillors here that have got experience in the agricultural sector. 2 of us live in the township, but 1 lives out in the area around Back Valley. So we have 3 people here in the room that have an understanding of agriculture. So I also believe that we look at the area that we are managing. If we can't get on top of an issue that we may not know the specific road, it's only a matter of 30-minute drive for any of us to go and look at that particular area. We have I think the square kilometres I've put in my report is it approximately 350 or 380? Anyone know? Whereas
346. 346.
346 Ks. Alexandrina Council has 1,800 approximately. They only have 3 wards. They have 8 townships. We have 1 township. So if we have 10 people on our website, and anyone can come to any 10 people. So I don't believe in wards, and I went to the election saying that.
In terms of where we are tonight, is there any other questions of Tracey just around the sort of overview and the process that is going to go through, noting that this is workshop 1, there's workshop 2, which is more consideration and options, before the report is drafted for workshop 3. So just in terms of time sort of around the process. Councillor Burns and then Councillor Freeman.
I just had a question about what would be an example of why a council would want to change its name. I understand if it went from a town to a city, or if it emerged, but what would be normal? Because I don't really see that that's an issue for us here, but I could be wrong.
So, for example, it happened when we had some of those sort of legacy issues of smaller councils merging. So they after a while, the chamber then determined what they might want to move forward with as a name. As you say, though, sometimes councils play around with the where district might go. District Council Mount Remarkable or Mount Remarkable District Council. Sometimes we see that happening. Generally, you don't tend to see sort of wholesale change of names, though. It is, but it goes back to those pages I've given you from the Local Government Act, because it is on there. It says councils, have to consider whether they want to change its name. Like, it is just something we actually just need to proactively show we turned your mind to as part of the process. That's all.
In regards to the process, so currently there's 3 elected members that are 4 wards and 5 that aren't. we're going to go out to community consultation after we have your report or before?
After the report. So the report will be drafted,
Right.
which will contain what it is that you would like to see as a governing body.
Right.
That goes it is the same process as your budgetary process. So you, just like you got the draft budget in the chamber, you'll get the draft representation review report in the chamber, and you will adopt that for public consultation purposes. We get the outcome of the public consultation. You then consider that. We determine whether or not any changes need to be made to the report. The report gets finalised, and then it goes back to the chamber, and you adopt that as your final report, and then that's the one we send to the Electoral Commissioner.
So hypothetically, if you were going to go to consultation now, you would say that the chamber, there's 3, 4 and 5 against as a recommendation in regards to wards. It goes out to consultation, and just to summarise, it comes back. If the community overwhelmingly wants it, it's not necessarily a trigger point like any consultation is, it's just another tool that we use.
So that's the old process where we went out with a number of options. Under this streamlined process...
No, sorry, not options, I mean as in like we go out to the community and say, is it a recommendation that we come back to, like if it goes out to the community?
So we are recommending that, so if for example you decide, and then that's where it comes back to we can't make decisions obviously in these forums, so there might need to be a draft report going to you in the chamber where we do have some formal decisions around wards or no wards. Because you need to choose wards or no wards, and if you choose wards, we need to choose 2, 3, 4, and then that's the report that we draft that you consult on. So we don't consult on all of the variations of those options.
Okay, so we're not going out to consultation on whether we have wards or not. It'll be whatever the chamber
No, it'll be what, yeah. Now, look, and of course, and having said that, so if, for example, you as a chamber say, we are going to retain our existing structure without wards, and that's the report you adopt, and then you consult on that. If you are overwhelming response as part of your consultation on that, and again, bearing in mind, the weight to be given to that, but if your consultation outcomes were overwhelmingly coming back to you saying we want wards, then my advice at that stage would be need to give some serious consideration to that. And that's what I'm saying. The report can be amended based on that consultation process.
The only problem is last time they did that, you had over 70% of the population came back saying no, and they got disregarded.
It's no wards.
No,
Which is what
wards.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That would have been probably 70% of the people that responded came back. So, and I guess that's the difficulty for elected members is it's not a vote, but it is one of the things you need to take into consideration. Because it's a tricky thing weighing up how much of the respondents in those public consultations, how much weight you give it. So
we really choose what we give weight to and what we don't, because we've had consultations where 67% of the people have said they want the sports precinct. That's based on 500 people, yet we still go ahead with it. So realistically, regardless of consultation, it's this chamber that decides what they put weight into.
Taking everything into consideration and all the information you've been provided and have. It's not envious of your role at all.
And I mean, look, and it's fair, and it is fair to say, and the process is you are elected by your residents and ratepayers to make those decisions here in the chamber for and on their behalf and what you consider is to be in the best interest of the community. Sometimes those decisions will be difficult ones to make, and sometimes those decisions your community might not necessarily think it's in their best interest. So I think things like increasing rates is always a great example of that. But it doesn't mean that that's not the decision that you feel like it needs to be made in the interest of the council moving forward. And I think this can be one of the challenging decisions to make for councils. And I remember we did some assistance with Onkaparinga, that process, losing 8 elected members as part of a representation review process was really challenging, for that group of members. It is, I find it a really interesting process. I do feel that, I think it's probably sometimes unfair making elected members do this because it is so governed by the Electoral Commissioner and the rules and regulations around it, and I think there's probably scope to consider whether this is something the Electoral Commissioner should be doing rather than than councils. But certainly this is the process we have, and it's your time to do this again.
Do we as an elected body have input into consultation that goes out to the community? In other words, because you're saying we won't be asking our community whether they want wards or no wards, but a lot of the community will want to have a decision on that too.
So it is absolutely up to you. So what I've outlined to you is what the process is under the Act. But you might choose to do an initial engagement around some of that first before we do the report. And so there would be nothing prohibiting that. Again, though, it's in terms of you would need to know what the cost of that was as well, and we just would need to factor it into the timeline. Again, it just also becomes a decision around, you know, how much weight might go into that. But if you are, you know, as elected members, understanding that this is going to be a significant issue for your residents and ratepayers, then, you know, it might be something you choose to do some of that early engagement on before we prepare the report. In terms of the consultation process, it was very directive before we had the amendments. Now the Act just says you need to consult, and you need to consult in accordance with your public consultation policy. So that means we actually only need, at a minimum now, to do a 3-week consultation process on the report as well. But again, the consultation process is up to you. It's up to you where it goes, where it's posted, what websites it goes on, how long you want it to be consulted on for. So that are conversations to have with your media engagement, your media liaison people around what your consultation process will be.
South Coast Television, your community, your voice.